Imagine being captured by the enemy, locked behind barbed wire, surrounded by armed guards who have been given one very simple instruction: shoot anyone who tries to run. And somehow, against every logical reason to stay put and survive, you decide that escaping is worth the risk not once, not twice, but 3 separate times, knowing full well what happens to men who get caught in the attempt. And yet you do it anyway, because something inside you simply refuses to accept that a fence and a uniform can define the limits of your life. That man was Airey Neave, and by the time this story is over, you are going to understand exactly why the Germans considered him one of the most dangerous prisoners they ever had the misfortune of capturing. It was 1940 when Neave first found himself on the wrong side of the wire, and the circumstances of his capture were already the kind of thing that would break most men before the real ordeal even began. Because he hadn't simply been taken prisoner in some quiet backwater skirmish. He had been wounded during the fall of Calais, one of the most brutal and desperate last-stand battles of the early war, where British troops fought street by street, building by building, knowing that evacuation wasn't coming for them, knowing that they were essentially being sacrificed to buy time for Dunkirk. And when Neave finally went down, it wasn't from cowardice or surrender. It was from a piece of German metal that found him in the chaos. And even then, lying wounded on French soil, the thought forming in the back of his mind wasn't despair, but something far more inconvenient for his captors. It was calculation. The Germans processed him like thousands of others, patched him up just enough to be useful as a prisoner, and sent him into the camp system that was already becoming one of the most elaborate containment operations in military history. Because the Wehrmacht had quickly discovered that British officers were, to put it diplomatically, absolutely terrible at staying where you put them, and the system of stalags and oflags spread across occupied Europe was the German answer to a very persistent problem, which was that these men seemed constitutionally incapable of accepting captivity as a permanent condition. And Neave, from the very first day behind the wire, was already studying the fence, studying the guards, studying the rhythms and routines of the camp with the kind of focused attention that most people reserve for things they actually enjoy. Because for Airey Neave, escape wasn't a hobby or a fantasy. It was a professional obligation. His first attempt came at Stalag 20A in Poland, and it was the kind of escape that tells you everything about the man's character, because it wasn't elaborate or theatrical. It was almost insultingly simple, which in many ways made it more impressive than any tunnel or disguise, because Neave essentially walked out of the camp during a work detail, slipped away from the column with the kind of casual confidence that makes guards assume you're supposed to be somewhere else. And for a brief, glorious period, he was free, moving through occupied Poland with nothing but his wits, his school German, and an absolutely staggering level of nerve, until the reality of being a British officer alone in Nazi-controlled territory with no papers, no contacts, and no real plan caught up with him, and he was recaptured and returned to captivity, which the Germans assumed would be a sufficient lesson in the futility of escape. They were, as it turned out, catastrophically wrong about that. What the Germans failed to understand about men like Neave, and this is something that becomes a recurring theme in almost every serious escape story from the Second World War, is that a failed escape attempt doesn't function as a deterrent the way a logical person might expect it to, because instead of teaching the prisoner that escape is impossible, a failed attempt actually teaches him what not to do next time. It functions as incredibly expensive and dangerous field research, and Neave returned from his recapture not broken or chastened, but genuinely better informed about the problem he was trying to solve, which was the problem of how a British officer gets from the middle of Nazi-controlled Europe to somewhere that isn't Nazi-controlled Europe. And the answer, he was beginning to understand, required more than just courage. It required infrastructure, documents, contacts, and above all, patience of the kind that most people simply don't possess. The Germans, having run out of patience with Neave and others like him, made a decision that seemed logical from a containment standpoint, but turned out to be one of the great strategic miscalculations of the prisoner management operation, which was to concentrate their most escape-prone, most troublesome, most relentlessly uncooperative officers in a single location where they could all be watched more carefully. And that location was Colditz Castle, Oflag 4C, a medieval fortress sitting on a rocky outcrop above the town of Colditz in Saxony, which the Germans had converted into what they genuinely believed was an escape-proof facility, and which they were proud of in the way that people are always proud of things right before those things fail spectacularly. Because what they had actually done, by filling Colditz with every serious escape artist in the British officer corps, was create the single most densely concentrated collection of escape expertise, engineering talent, and motivated problem solvers that has ever been assembled behind a single set of walls. Colditz was, by any reasonable measure, extraordinarily difficult to escape from. And it's worth being honest about that rather than pretending it was just a matter of trying hard enough. Because the castle sat on a cliff, the walls were thick stone that had been keeping people in since the medieval period. The guards were more numerous than in regular camps. The security protocols were tighter. And the castle had been extensively surveyed by German engineers, who were specifically looking for weaknesses before the prisoners arrived. So when Neave looked at Colditz for the first time and began his assessment, he was looking at a genuinely serious problem, the kind of problem that separates the men who talk about escaping from the men who actually do it. And what he saw when he looked carefully, and Neave always looked carefully, was that the Germans, for all their thoroughness, had made one assumption that wasn't quite correct, which was that they had found everything worth finding. The escape that Neave eventually pulled off at Colditz in January 1942 has become one of the most celebrated in the history of the war, not because it was the most dramatic or the most violent, but because it was the first successful home run, meaning the first escape from Colditz that actually resulted in a prisoner getting all the way back to Britain rather than being recaptured somewhere in Germany. And it was achieved through a combination of theatrical ingenuity and cold-blooded nerve that still reads like something a novelist would be embarrassed to invent, because it's almost too good. Because Neave and his escape partner Tony Lutain didn't tunnel out, or climb out, or fight their way out. They walked out of the front gate dressed as German officers, in uniforms that had been constructed inside the castle by prisoners, using dyed materials, and whatever they could steal or manufacture. And the audacity of it is almost offensive, almost insulting to every principle of sensible risk management, except that it worked. The uniforms were not perfect. They were the product of ingenuity and improvisation rather than access to actual German military tailoring. and any guard who looked closely enough would have seen through the disguise, which meant that the entire success of the plan depended on Neave and Lutain walking through that gate with exactly the right energy, the right posture, the right casual authority that says, I belong here, and I am mildly irritated that you're even looking at me. And this is where Neave's particular psychology becomes the decisive factor in the story. Because most people, when they are one wrong glance away from being shot, do not radiate casual authority. They radiate terror. And terror is readable, and readable is fatal. But Neave had spent months preparing for this moment, not just physically, but mentally, rehearsing not just the route, but the internal state. And when the moment came, he walked through that gate, the way a man walks through his own front door, and the guard let him pass. What followed was weeks of travel across occupied Europe using forged papers and the escape network that had been quietly built by resistance organizations, moving through Germany into Switzerland with the kind of methodical patience that the escape itself had required. Because getting out of Colditz was only the beginning of a journey that required navigating hundreds of miles of enemy territory where a wrong word, a suspicious innkeeper, or a routine document check could end everything. And the fact that Neave made it, that he crossed into Switzerland, made contact with British authorities, and eventually returned to England, was the result not just of the preparation and the contacts, but of a quality that is genuinely hard to teach, which is the ability to keep functioning normally when every nerve in your body is telling you that something is about to go catastrophically wrong. When Neave finally walked back into Britain, it wasn't the end of his contribution to the escape story. It was almost the beginning of the most important part, because the British intelligence services understood immediately that a man who had successfully navigated the escape networks of occupied Europe was not someone you sent back to the front to get captured again. He was someone you put to work building and improving the systems that got other men home. And Neave spent the rest of the war working for MY9, the organization responsible for helping Allied servicemen evade capture and escape from it, using everything he had learned in Colditz and on the road to Switzerland to make the escape lines faster, safer, and more reliable for the hundreds of men who came after him, which means that the story of Airey Neave isn't just a story about one man's escape. It's a story about how one man's refusal to accept captivity eventually helped dozens of others find their way home. The Germans never quite reconciled themselves to the fact that Colditz had been beaten, and the institutional embarrassment of it drove increasingly elaborate security measures that, in the darkly comic way that these things tend to work, mostly served to give the prisoners new problems to solve and therefore new skills to develop. And the community of escapers that Neave had been part of continued producing attempts of increasing creativity throughout the war, including a glider that was being secretly constructed in the attic of the castle when the American army arrived to liberate the place in 1945. A glider that never flew, but that stands as perhaps the most extraordinary monument to the particular madness that captivity produces in men who refuse to be contained, because they had been building an aircraft in an attic using stolen materials and homemade tools in the middle of a medieval castle surrounded by German guards, which is the kind of thing that makes you wonder what these men might have accomplished if someone had just given them a proper workshop and left them alone. Airey Neave went on to have a remarkable post-war life, became a lawyer, and then a politician, was one of Margaret Thatcher's closest allies and the man most responsible for her rise to the leadership of the Conservative Party, and was assassinated by the INLA in 1979 with a car bomb planted in the House of Commons car park, which is an ending so shocking that it almost feels like a different story entirely, except that it fits the pattern of a life that was always lived at the sharpest possible edge of consequence, a life that began defining itself in a prison camp in Poland in 1940, when a wounded young officer looked at the fence around him and decided, with complete seriousness, that the fence was a problem to be solved rather than a fact to be accepted, and spent the next 5 years proving that he was right. The thing that stays with you when you read deeply into the escape stories of the Second World War is not the cleverness of the tunnels or the audacity of the disguises, though those things are genuinely impressive. It's the sheer psychological weight of what these men were carrying every single day, the maintenance of hope in conditions specifically designed to extinguish it, the daily performance of normalcy in circumstances that were anything but normal, and the particular kind of courage that isn't the loud, explosive courage of the battlefield, but the quiet, grinding courage of men who wake up every morning behind the same wire and choose again to keep working on the problem. And if that sounds like the kind of history worth knowing about, then you're in exactly the right place, because there are hundreds more stories where this one came from, and we are just getting started.